then we'll share a screen and get started.
Okay. Good afternoon and welcome back on day 2 of the forum. I am Legita Wilson with the Indiana Department of Health WIC Division. Please remember to remain muted during the presentation. And if you have any questions, drop them into the chat and we will have time for a Q&A at the end. I'm pleased to introduce Emily Syrija with the Michigan Farmers Market Association to address managing risk and preparing for emergencies at the farmers market. As the operations director at the Michigan Farmers Market Association, Emily is passionate about providing farmers market managers with the resources they need to create truly thriving marketplaces in their communities. Since 2015, Emily has been providing educational talks to farmers market managers about the importance of risk management and supporting markets through the process of developing, reviewing, and revising emergency preparedness plans. Welcome, Emily. You have the floor.
Thank you so much. Much appreciated. I am Emily Syrija. I'm the operations director, as she said, for Michigan Farmers Market Association. And we are a statewide member-based association based in Michigan, of course, with a vision to place farmers markets at the forefront of the local food movement and to ensure that residents have access to healthy, locally grown food and policy support for our Michigan farmers markets and beyond. So when we talk about risk management, I usually start with an inventory of some of the most common risks that farmers markets incur. With so many markets being outdoors at least part of the year, of course, weather-related emergencies are probably the thing that most of us think about first. We may also have dealt with injuries or other medical emergencies that occur at the market, and we hope not to experience violent incidents or other unusual circumstances, but they are something to consider and to prepare for. Those are some of the emergency situations, and that's mostly what we're going to focus our time on today. But I also do a lot of work with risk management by way of liability insurance and legal counsel for farmers markets. And so some other liabilities that markets might incur are product liability, so an unsafe or otherwise tainted product, mislabeled, et cetera, being sold at the farmers market. Markets can, in some cases, be liable for that. Incidents with vehicles, parking, traffic, in rare circumstances, vendor grievances, so issues that a vendor takes up with the market in a legal sense, could be a potential liability. And of course, going back to that weather thing, market infrastructure and tents are things that markets will really need to be thoughtful, proactive about waiting and supporting those, so that in a weather-related situation, that there is more security. So I like to clarify this terminology before I get too started into the presentation of what constitutes an incident versus what constitutes an event. So for the purposes of this presentation, an event is going to be a market or its programming, something that is pre-planned and can be canceled if needed in an emergency situation. An incident is something that is not pre-planned, cannot be canceled, and generally comes as a surprise. And within that, there's the subcategory of an emergency, which requires urgent response and a specified protocol for that. So when I speak about emergencies today, just so that we're all on the same page, that's what I'm referring to as something that does require an immediate response and ideally has a protocol for personnel to follow. So I'll start with some general rules in an emergency. They may seem like common sense, but the more we practice and familiarize ourselves with them and keep them in our minds, the more likely we'll be able to access them in an emergency when we need them. So first and foremost, and I'm sure I'll end up stressing this over and over throughout the presentation, but it's so critical to remain calm and to cooperate with any emergency personnel who may be contacted to support you. If requested, we recommend that able-bodied folks do assist emergency personnel, but only when they are asked to do so, so as not to impede any support that emergency personnel are offering. Keep areas clear, especially areas that may need passage for emergency vehicles. And in an evacuation situation, even if it seems to go back, even if it seems clear to go back, be sure that that does not occur until authorized by emergency personnel. And when I say remain calm, I think that that can be a little bit hard to swallow, or can come off as sort of disingenuous in certain cases, because no one is a perfect Zen guru with the ability to stay completely relaxed during an emergency situation. There will be a level of stress or duress to the situation, but it's more about being able to access the part of yourself that knows that you have planned for this, and that you can help your market to be safe. Sorry, I got distracted by a little pop-up there. So I will just really try to hammer in that preparation is the best way to be able to access that calm. And the more prepared that you are for an emergency, the easier it will be in the moment to stay calm if you ever are faced with one. And even in the planning process, there is a confidence that comes from knowing that, although obviously we hope not to endure an emergency at our market, that if so, we are prepared. So here is just an overview of all of the tools that we have at our disposal for emergency preparedness as market managers. Supplies, of course, are something that we recommend that you have on hand. And I think when a lot of us think about emergency preparedness, we are thinking about things like having a first aid kit, or nowadays in the age of the coronavirus, we're more likely to have personal protective equipment on hand than we did at one time. First aid kits, and for medical situations that can be handled by a non-professional, is a great thing. But also being along with something like a first aid kit also knows how to use, also goes knowing how to use that first aid kit. So that's important there. Traffic cones and barriers, or ways to keep people out of an evacuated area, can also be really helpful, and other implements that you might use in your market to amplify sound and to direct people. So those are a few things that we recommend, but in the PDF resource that I am going to discuss and share with you all, there is a longer checklist of things that you might want to have on hand at your market in case of an emergency situation. Another really critical part of the toolkit for emergency preparedness is going to be phone numbers, and making sure that you have these written down in one place, but also that everyone, all of the market personnel who need these numbers do have them. So usually at least one person other than the on-site market manager. That being said, we would want everyone to be able to access the on-site manager or the market manager overall, even if they are not necessarily on-site, depending on the situation. Collecting, being able to contact law enforcement, any market security that your market might have, and being able to do that at a second's notice is going to help a lot in a situation that may need to be responded to quickly, as well as other resources like hospital, poison control, anything that may be sort of out of our depths as non-professionals in those regards. Emergency contacts is also something that I really emphasize. I encourage putting emergency contact information as a a spot in your vendor application so that if and when each vendor is selected for the market, you have the name and number of a contact who doesn't usually come on market day, but that you can notify about any incidents that need to occur regarding the their loved one or business contact. Finally, we're going to focus a lot today on documentation and having written resources that can support you in one of these situations. So having an emergency procedures document is something we'll spend a good amount of time on today, because MIFMA has some great templates for this that I'm looking forward to sharing with you. Having scripts for any public announcements that need to be made. So just a quick few sentences that are written out that you may need to announce over a bullhorn or PA system to let the market shoppers and others know exactly what is going on and what they need to do to respond. In these moments, as much as I emphasize staying calm, of course, we can get overwhelmed, and it's really helpful to have a script in front of us in our binder, or however we choose to keep our emergency preparedness materials together, that can help us with our words and to bring an air of sort of calm and neutrality to what we need to announce. I also strongly recommend, if you don't already, that your market creates an incident report form where folks can, where market personnel can document any incidents that occur at the market. And this is something that sometimes will be used in insurance follow-up or any criminal or legal proceedings that may occur following an emergency. So that's also going to be really important, and having both those blank forms and a process for filing them is something that I think as market managers we don't always get to. I know we're very time pressed people, but having that at your in your toolbox to be able to take down all of the relevant details of a situation as quickly as possible while you still remember it is going to help you a lot when it comes to follow up in the event that unfortunately you do experience some sort of injury or other harm to a person on site during an emergency at your farmer's market. So as I mentioned, one of the resources that we strongly recommend and that we are happy to share with you and to other market managers is our flip chart of emergency procedures for farmers markets. So this is a template document, and it has areas for you to enter important phone numbers. It has procedures for a wide variety of different potential incidents that could occur at the market, including evacuation procedures. So these incidents could be weather related. There is one for an active shooter, just lots of things that we hope will never occur at our market, and that many of us don't really spend much time thinking about in advance because of those situations. And we do have a template for that incident report form, which is something that I really emphasize, being the one who has to make those claims and do that follow-up for our organization as well. So we have a newly revamped website, and that can be found at mifma.org. We have a section on our website that is just for farmers market managers and has a lot of publications and resources available. This is a free PDF, so feel free to download it and review it. You may or may not choose to use it, or you may choose to adapt it into a version that works for you in your market. But this is a 30 or 35 or so page document that you can use as a sort of inventory for the types of incidents to be prepared for and how to do so. So in terms of process, I have some, there are some recommendations for what to do before, during, and after an emergency. I wouldn't say that these are all the steps because this is very generalized rather than for one type of emergency, but it's a good place to start. So of course, again, I'm recommending that folks go through that flip chart, during a calm time in the market season and make plans and have and set policies regarding potential emergencies, especially weather-related ones, because I think we tend to assume that those are the most likely, and have that ready to go, as part of your season. Market policies are something that are a great way to get all of your vendors and other market personnel on the same page and hold everyone sort of accountable to the same expectations and rules. And so reviewing your policies in conjunction with whatever emergency procedures you're developing can make sure that there's some consistency there, and also that your policy document, if you have one, is a reminder to your market personnel and vendors that that we are all expected to abide by these emergency procedures that you'll be developing. Market personnel in particular should really be informed of whatever set of policies and preparedness techniques you implement, and that preparedness should be tested. So being able to do drills or see how quickly you or your vendors or your volunteers can get tents down or clear an area. This is something you might think about doing at a vendor meeting, or prior to one particular market day. Another thing I haven't really touched on yet in terms of preparation for an emergency is the importance of relationship building. So in your toolkit, I didn't include relationships, but I think I should have, because when you know who will be supporting you in an emergency, first of all, again, that supports that sense of calm, but also it really establishes that you do have a process, and that all of the personnel that will be involved to the extent that you can. So of course, this can mean building relationships within the market and sort of knowing who on your team is the person who tends to kind of take charge in this situation, and whose leadership is respected, or situations where you might have particular personnel who really need to keep certain things in mind when it comes to safety. All of that, knowing your team, is important. But also building external relationships is something that can, again, really add to that sense of calm and help you out on the day of, if any emergency situation were unfortunately to occur. So when I talk about building relationships, I definitely recommend reaching out and potentially with an invitation for a market visit, or just some kind of friendly conversation with say local law enforcement, your local emergency management association, which is usually at the state or county level, as well as your local health department, folks that will likely be involved in one type of emergency response or another. They may also be able to recommend certain policies or evacuation procedures if your market is maybe not as accessible to folks who use wheelchairs or other devices who may need to evacuate a situation. You may be able to work with organizations in your community to really streamline that layout and make sure that it's safe for everyone to enter and exit freely, especially in an urgent situation. So I definitely recommend building community relationships with the people and organizations that and would like to see supporting you in a situation like this. I think often too for our farmers markets, we hope that we are really central to the community and that everybody knows where we're located. But I also know that in a lot of situations, we are a place, farmers markets are a place that don't necessarily have a mailing address that's the same as their location. And so if you are also building these relationships with emergency response organizations in your area, they will have a sense and they will have been to the market and know exactly what parking lot or park or other location that may not have a physical address they're looking for. So that's another thing to keep in mind there. During an emergency, of course, I will say it 1,000 times that it's really important to remain calm and to, access your toolkit and everything you know and have prepared for when it comes to emergencies. So we definitely recommend referring to that flip chart if you have filled out the MIFMA flip chart or any references you may have created, any binder or other things you want to access in such a situation. Follow the procedures there, including contacting emergency personnel as soon as possible. And again, those emergency personnel really should have phone numbers in your flip chart or your binder in a really prominent way so that you can just access them as quickly as you can. Follow any evacuation procedures or other medical procedures that may be required by the situation. And ultimately, once you are available, as a market manager in particular, I'm sure that your personnel would really appreciate receiving some leadership and support in terms of again, like sort of spreading that sense of calm and letting folks know that this is well handled and will be taken care of by the emergency personnel whose jobs it is to do so. So, in any like rushed situation, often there is a moment of pause, especially after the emergency personnel have arrived, where you usually will have an opportunity to sort of gather your people or check in with them individually and make sure everyone's needs are being met and everyone is feeling feeling as safe as they possibly can in this situation. Once we do see resolution to an emergency, it's very critically important to account for all of your people and make sure you have you can account for all of your market staff and volunteers, as well as your vendors. If you need to contact emergency contacts for your vendors, staff, or volunteers, this is a good time to do that when the situation is being handled, but when you have enough of a view on the situation to explain what has happened and what is being done to correct the situation. Once it's safe to do so, you can then assess the damage that may have occurred due to a weather event or other emergency situation, and see if there is anything outstanding that poses any kind of threat or risk. So for example, if there are broken tents with exposed poles that could harm someone, things like that, to assess that and correct is going to be sort of a conclusive step in mitigating any further damage or harm that could be caused. At that time, definitely recommend filling out an incident report for the situation while it is fresh in your mind. And since I believe we'll have a good amount of time left, I'm happy to pull up that incident report sample that I am talking about, but just collect as much and as detailed information as possible for any insurance or legal proceedings that may have been invoked in response to this situation. And ultimately, once things have been resolved, consider whether it is necessary and appropriate to address the incident publicly, either on social media or maybe just in a communication to shoppers, vendors, and personnel who were there that day. So so that is something that is a little bit more sensitive, might be a more of a PR situation if you are thinking about bringing this up publicly. If it has any news coverage or anything that you want to get in front of, then that's going to be important to have a strategy for. But at least consider going back to that leadership and support that we expect from a market manager to provide that for your staff, volunteers, and vendors who are looking to get some solace or some answers in response to what occurred and how it's been handled, and if you know what this means for the market moving forward. So if there was a weather event, say, that destroyed a significant amount of market infrastructure, you may need a few weeks pause, and you may need to say that we are assessing we continue to assess the damage, and the market will be on hiatus until that occurs. Again, we don't want to get to that point, but it can happen, and it is something that a market needs to plan for and address. So ultimately, I am going to open this up, and we can have a conversation about any outstanding questions, because I have approached this in a very general sense. And I know that normally when we hear these very basic guidelines, we want to kind of talk a little bit more about scenarios, and I'm happy to do that to the extent that I can. The top messages that I really want to convey today is that planning now will help you feel calmer later, and that this process of planning for an emergency really isn't as intimidating as it seems. I promise that at MIFMA, we have really tried to make this an accessible process and to emphasize not just how important it is, but to make it as simple as we can. And so the flip chart of emergency procedures is something that we use at our own farmers market. We operate a special events market 3 times a year on our state capitol lawn, and we use this very same flip chart every season, and have used it to respond to in particular, I recall a high winds incident where we needed to cancel the market, and we had to bring in emergency personnel due to an injury. So we use these. We wouldn't recommend them to you if we don't. So it is a fairly complete and thorough sort of checklist for emergency preparedness that we're quite proud of. I also, really try to emphasize to our market managers and market personnel that emergency preparedness is a big component of leadership, and is a way to exercise that leadership over your market. Anything that you can do to ensure that your vendors and personnel really know that they are taken care of, and that this is a community, is really critical to the success of your market, and to building a stronger community, which I think is a mission for many of us in the farmers market world. So I'm happy to show any chunks of the emergency procedures document, and you can absolutely download it yourself from our website. I'd strongly recommend at least taking a look and seeing if it's a fit for you and your market, or if you might want to reformat or repackage it in a way that works better for you. We also, one of our resources that we used in creating this emergency procedures document was from FEMA, and they have some great contingency planning resources. They're a little bit more they're a little bit more dense, and those documents are definitely longer, but their contingency planning job aid for special events is usually the one that is most relevant to most farmers markets. And that's a resource that we referred to learn a little bit more about the specific different types of incidents that might occur. So I have included my contact information, but it looks like we also have a good amount of time to chat, and I see some questions popping up in the chat box that we can address. So feel free to screenshot my contact information. I'll also put it in the chat if you have questions that we don't have time to get to today, or that you might, or that might be, sort of specific that you want to discuss with me in more detail. So happy to help with that.
So Emily, there was a question. So how does a market manager actually implement, let me go back to the question, a drill?
Yeah.
How do you do a test run?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, obviously it will depend a little bit on what the procedure is, but in terms of like a fire evacuation is probably one that's practiced in particularly indoor spaces. So at a very minimum, I recommend training your staff and volunteers on this, and including it in your maybe including an exit route in your market policies, or anything that your vendors have to sign off on at the beginning of the season. I think for most of us, getting our vendors to participate in any kind of fire drill or evacuation drill is not the most realistic expectation. But I would definitely work with your local emergency management association or fire department, whoever might be sort of the authority there in developing an evacuation route for your market, and both indoor and outdoor locations if you have both, and mapping that out and doing, maybe at the beginning of the season, maybe in the middle of the season, performing one of those drills on market day, or if you're fortunate enough to have a staff and volunteers that are able to work with you on non-work days, if you are full-time or any of your staff are, then that could be an option, but I recognize for many of us, it's not. So yeah, I would say that emergency management resources in your community are a great place to start. And we also work pretty closely at MIFMA with the Michigan Emergency Management Association, and I imagine there is something similar in your state that can help you map out a route and ensure that your procedures are sound, whether or not you have time and capacity to run them as drills. I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, we'll see if people have other questions. What about situations where things get violent? Do you recommend having the police come out and do a walkthrough with you, so at least they're comfortable with the layout of the market? How do you work with the police department in that type of capacity?
Yeah, I always, when I talk about working with law enforcement in particular, I always have to add the caveat that at MIFMA, we really believe in mission-driven market management, and in some in some organizations and in some communities, law enforcement may not feel like the safest resource for everyone. So that is something to consider. But from a safety standpoint, in an emergency situation, that usually is going to be your best resource, to particularly if you operate under a sheriff's department. That is a type of law enforcement situation where those personal relationships can really help, and a walkthrough is something that a walkthrough would be a great option. Yeah, like I said, they law enforcement or emergency management professionals are going to have the best sense of your market layout and things that might not occur to you as a lay person, or are just very used to the way the market is laid out. So a lot of emergency management organizations and sometimes law enforcement do have active shooter programming that they use as an educational tool. And so that could be, in some cases that can be a walkthrough or a drill, but very often it might be a short reading or a video that you can pass on to your vendors and staff and volunteers that they can review. And FEMA has some of these as well, I believe. Yeah.
The FEMA resources will be on that one website you shared with us?
Yes, yeah. FEMA.org has a section for job aids and resources. And I really recommend, although it's quite dense, I really recommend the special events version of their contingency planning job aids for farmers markets.
There was a question in your toolkit. Do you have like a script or something that could be used for a missing child, like something appropriate that you can broadcast during the market?
Yes, I believe that it does require for a missing person. It does have a script for a missing person announcement that you would make. And I would say that if I'm not recalling offhand if they do have one, but I definitely recommend having a script. I think that's one of the most frequent, incidents we would see at a farmer's market that would require a PA announcement or something like that. If our flip chart doesn't have one, because I'm not remembering off the top of my head, definitely that is something that local law enforcement will support you in having a policy for and having a process for.
So we have an excellent question, because you mentioned violence at the market, which we hope doesn't happen, but I know we have quite a few markets that are pet friendly.
Yes.
How do you handle dogs and dogs that attack? Because that's a pretty charged situation.
Yes, that can be a pretty charged situation, and it is one that is of the sort of common emergencies or incidents that occur at farmers markets. It is one that's like more likely to require legal follow-up. So it's definitely something to consider in having a policy for. If animals are not permitted at your market, then that's more of an enforcement situation. How do you enforce and show visual indications of your own policy? But if you do operate a pet-friendly market, then dog attacks are a potential concern and liability. So in those cases, it's sort of important to. I think part of the reason that is such a frequent concern that we have as market managers is partly because it's very layered and it kind of encases multiple types of emergencies that we can see at the farmers market. So it can result in a medical incident that needs to be addressed, and that can occur on site if you have anyone who is trained to do so or comfortable doing so, if it's a very superficial injury, and if you have the consent of the person who has been attacked or bitten. In other situations, it may be primarily just an issue of de-escalation and making sure that it doesn't devolve into an incident or argument between two humans, because like you said, these can be very tense and difficult. So this is where remaining calm to assess a situation is going to be really important, because there is a bit of a triage. It's like we need to address any medical concerns first, and get the involved parties away from the situation so that it is a little bit calmer and can be resolved. But then to, either perform some form of first aid for a superficial injury, again, with the victim's consent, or to contact medical personnel. This is also a really important situation for something like an incident report, because this is one of the situations most frequently, I think, at farmers markets where, it may result in some kind of complaint against the market or particular, vendors at your market. So documenting everything you can about the details of the injury, any medical treatment that was given by you or by personnel who showed up, and as much information as you have on the preceding events that led to that attack, documenting as much as you can as soon as possible while it's still fresh in your memory is going to be really critical for any potential legal liabilities or disputes.
So there's a follow-up question about dog incidents at the market. So if you're a pet-friendly market, is it smart to post clearly that, like, your dog policy, you are responsible for your dog? I don't remember ever seeing any policy, so right off I can't really come up with formulation, but like at basic entrances of the markets and at your farmers market tent, is it important like to post signs like owners are responsible for their dog's behavior? I don't know. Can you help me with that?
Yeah, it can't hurt. I am not a legal expert, and I think that different like legal counsel may have different recommendations as to actually how to phrase that so that it actually could support you or the market in a potential liability situation. It may or may not hold up in those cases, depending on how it's phrased, but also just given the fact that the market does allow pets, and that whether your pet is an appropriate pet to bring to the market is a little bit of a subjective distinction. But yeah, I would also say too that I know a lot of farmers markets are affiliated with like county resource, with a county organization. And you may also consider working with your local like humane society or animal control and get an understanding of their licensing requirements for animals, because you could also consider some sort of policy licensed animals are only be on this point. I'm not talking about ADA licensed necessarily, but yeah. And I would also clarify too that when it comes to animals, that if we are doing signage on your policy, to really specify pets as opposed to animals, just so that it's clear you are not prohibiting any support animals for folks with disabilities, as that would be in conflict with the ADA.
That's a great point. There was a post by one of our market managers that they post dog guidelines on their website and as reminders in the newsletter.
Yes.
So that's really good.
Yeah, and that kind of consistency in your messaging, signage is great, but the consistency in your messaging can also really help support you, especially when you're dealing with a potential legal liability.
So basically get your policy out there and keep reminding people, and that will stay ahead. Maybe even if a situation starts to de-escalate, get a hold of, 911, get the police out there right away, so then they can help also kind of mitigate. The scenario could be a good policy depending on what's happening.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of the time, part of the reason that these situations can be dangerous or difficult is because they can escalate to confrontations between people. And so it's a very touchy, subject for a lot of pet owners. And so that is something to consider, that it may be a situation where law enforcement or other de-escalation resources may be required.
And probably just having your policies out there would be the best way to get ahead of that, because you want to be pet friendly or animal or dog friendly, like you said.
Yeah.
And then you realize that sometimes somebody could have a bad day. Probably also another tip, I don't know, how about like if the situation happens, that maybe the market manager also approach with a colleague, so it's not one person going into the situation by themselves, kind of like the buddy system. A vendor, it could be someone who's maybe level-headed, that they respect, that could help be their backup in these types of situations. I mean, that could also help provide a little additional support.
Absolutely. One resource that we have at MIFMA, and I believe it's available on our website, but if it's not and you would like to see it, please feel free to email me and I can send it to you. But MIFMA actually made a YouTube video a couple years ago about dog safety at the farmers market, and that might be something that you would want to share on your market's social media or newsletter. Like, did you know? And use that to accompany your pet policy. It really focuses on knowing your pet and really thinking critically about whether the market is an appropriate environment for your pet on a given day. So that's something to consider. It's just another potential reinforcement where maybe it might be a little bit more visible than like a written mention, or just could be, fodder for your social media feed if you want to keep.
Yeah, or on your Facebook.
Yeah, consistent
where your policy is. I don't want to skip this question, and I know I see we have some new ones.
Mhm.
How do you deal with language barriers? That could work either way. I mean, it could be from the vendor side or your customer side.
Yeah. Great question. I think that is a pretty, even in non-emergency situations, I think that is something that a lot of markets and communities struggle with. Very often in the farmers market sector, we also talk a lot about how market management and staffing usually isn't as diverse as the communities they serve. And so when it comes to language barriers, I think that's something we really notice, and that we've probably all experienced to a certain extent at our own markets, depending on the linguistic diversity of our communities. So at MIFMA, we always recommend looking at the languages that are prominent in your community, and using as many images as possible, or visuals, including evacuation maps, to support the situation for folks who may not be able to fully understand a PA announcement, especially in a stressful situation. So I definitely recommend using imagery and visual as much as you can, to support that, including especially marking exits and emergency exits in a very prominent and visual way. But if your market has the resources too, I recommend looking into what languages are frequently spoken in your community and thinking about what signage, or even announcements, even very brief announcements, you could consider getting translated. At MIFMA, because of the languages most frequently spoken in Michigan, we issue all of our new materials as they come out in English, Spanish, and Arabic, because those are the most common languages spoken in Michigan at this time. And we, there are accredited translators who can work on a freelance basis to translate your market signage and materials. But there are also like local organizations. We've worked with grad students in the past. So translation resources can be more accessible than we think they are. So visuals will always communicate it to the biggest number of people, including people who maybe are challenged with literacy, and also children who cannot yet read. So definitely everything as much as you can in a visual format, and exits and entrances clearly marked, especially those for emergencies. But translation resources may be more accessible than you think, and that's always something I'd like to mention for at least written communication.
So this was a really good question. And I guess because of the nature is like, what are your recommendations if you host outside groups like a nonprofit for a day and something happens? Do you recommend having a simple template that you hand them when they come to the market, like during a weather emergency? I mean, because sometimes it's hard if you send them an email, people don't always like read their emails before they head out to the market. And most vendors would have weighed down tents, but then, you've got this nonprofit showing up, it's a high wind day. So what's your take on that? How do you?
Yeah, I mean, I hope and would imagine that as a market manager, you're able to, you have time, although I know sometimes we're pressed, but to walk around and give the market a once over before it opens and check in. So I think that's a good time to at a minimum point out the exits and entrances to any of these, one-time vendors or booths at your market. You could consider a printout, especially if an evacuation situation is likely on a given day. But in a lot of situations, but often high winds are not necessarily an evacuation situation. It might be more if there's an announcement about high winds, we all travel to this location. So it can be verbal. I don't think that like a written handout is necessary in most cases, but if it is an unusual day, then that might be something to consider.
In your kit, do you have like generic templates that like for your basic emergencies that you can just kind of like rebrand for your market and then
absolutely
kind of distribute it?
Yeah, I'll see if it'll let me
pull it up for us, please.
Yeah,
I think they'd appreciate that.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm seeing if it'll let me fill. Don't look at all my too many emails that are disorganized. Okay.
Oh, here's one. Yeah.
Can folks see that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. So I described the flip chart, and I really should just like show you what it looks like. But it is, templates for phone numbers, things that you can look up in advance and write down so that you have them in front of you when you need them. But in terms of procedures and incident reporting, these suggested procedures are going to be there, and I recommend, obviously, at the beginning of your season or whenever, reviewing them to make sure that they're a good fit for your market and adapting them in the way that makes the most sense for your market's layout. But here we have, a general evacuation procedure. We have some scripts. And then they are sort of broken down by different emergencies that can occur at market. So there's a process for medical emergencies. I see bloodborne pathogens here, fire, severe weather. I know, tornadoes are something to watch in many parts of the country and in the Midwest. So flooding, they're all kind of water contamination. So they're all kind of broken down into some pretty specific sections about different emergencies that might occur at the market and what procedures to follow in those situations. So I'm just scrolling through that so folks can see these templates and these sample walkthroughs that we have.
Wow, that's very thorough.
Yeah, it's almost scary to look at and have the reality hit you of, oh, this is what could happen. But again, it's that preparation thing that can really instill confidence and security in yourself as a market manager and for the market as a whole.
I think I've caught everybody's questions. So please don't feel shy. Just drop them in the chat or put up, I can unmute yourself and ask, please.
Yeah. I really appreciate the comment in the chat too. I think in reference to the sort of like nonprofit or community organization scenario that we discussed. Absolutely, in terms of insurance requirements, even if it's for a day, insurance requirements, tent weight, because as Kat says, it's just the fact that they're there for one day doesn't mean that something can't happen that day. If they're bringing their own tent or tables or other things that need to be weighted down, having that be part of your walkthrough, especially for anyone who is new, is going to be really important. Reviewing that something like a tent weight is in place, and that they know that that's expected of them prior to and at the market, because that liability is still going to be there if it happens even once.
I think that's a really good point that we sometimes forget with the one-time participants, that they need to follow the market rules, and you need to make sure that they're they're also participating and they're insured because they could be liable and you could be liable.
Yes.
And agencies can, I think they could just get OneDay event certificates.
Yep.
So I don't think it's that necessarily difficult to implement. So
Yeah, I agree. And even if your market's insurance requirements, for example, require vendors to list you as an additional insured or something like that, even that is something that nonprofit organizations or community organizations of a certain size, that's going to be a common request for them if they table frequently. And so they are probably, even for a one-day situation, more likely to comply with that than we might assume.
thank you. Well, we've had quite a good chat going on about with questions. Anybody else? Oh, someone was having issues finding the templates.
Yeah, which
I'll make sure.
yeah, let me put a link to the document.
Can you drop it in the chat, please? I think someone did already, but if you can put it back in again.
Absolutely. Yeah.